Okay, I call to order this March 29th, 2022 special Planning Commission meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:04 p.m.
I call to order this March 29th, 2022.
Hey, Jesso, can you mute your...
Yeah, I turned it off, sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. Where was I? Okay, great. We are back for the first time in a long time in the Moab City Council chambers, live after a very, very long absence, and I'm really excited that we're all here and to welcome our new Planning Commission members and our new assistant planner and our new head planner who was the assistant planner, and it's awesome. Great. In attendance, we have Planning Commissioners Jill Tatton, Jeremy Lynch, Ruben Villapando Salas, Becky Wells, and remotely Jessica O'Leary, also myself, Kaya Marienfeld. This is a special meeting about a proposed ordinance that the city is in the process of working on, 2022-05, to amend several sections of our municipal code in the underlying R3 and R4 zones. We are having a citizens to be heard portion of the meeting. We have received comments both through the city's public comment form, email, and then other engagement prior to this meeting that we'll address and bring up if those folks aren't here to speak. And then we have an action item on that proposed ordinance. Normally, citizens to be heard would be about items not on the agenda, but I am happy to waive that this evening if that's fine with the other commissioners. Okay, citizens to be heard. Please limit your comments to 2 minutes. If you come up to the microphone, state who you are, your first and last name, that's all you need. If you have an association with an organization or a business, that's also welcome. Okay, come on up. I genuinely forgot how to do this. Yeah, so just come up, make sure to speak into the mic mainly so that the recording and the folks watching on YouTube can hear and see.
My name is Kyle Kaiser. I live here in Moab. I submitted a comment via email and via the form as well, just to make sure that it got in there somewhere. But I will go ahead and read what I have here. The proposed ordinance regarding R3, R4 zoning is a blunt and misguided approach to addressing a complex problem. This ordinance ignores the economics, market forces, and motivations that play in a way that will have a negative effect on the affordability, availability, and amount of housing in Moab. It will create swift and detrimental side effects in surrounding zoning and the Moab housing market, grind high-density development to a halt, and actually reverse it by pushing development towards less density. Simply put, any restriction on housing will result in less of it. If it seems clear that we do not have enough supply now, this will make it worse. A restriction on development will only spur developers to find profit in other ways, in this case by subdividing parcels, building twin homes, building high-end single-family homes, and subsuming commercial zoning for residential purposes. Instead of high-density residential downtown, you are going to see demolition of existing homes, subdividing and construction of high-end twin homes and single-family residences in the city center, further exacerbating the housing issue the city is trying to alleviate and wasting the potential of high-density residential land. Commercial zoning will be taken over by high-density residential due to lack of restrictions. You have commercial zoning turned into residential housing instead of places of business. Where will those businesses go, or where will it be possible to have your business? I have already witnessed plans for multiple C4 zone properties to be converted to residences. We have a zoning code in Moab notable for its exclusionary nature. Many uses and density options are excluded from being built. It has gotten worse over time, and it's what's led us here today. The high-density overlay in the county, an inclusionary zoning measure, was strongly supported by developers and brought many projects and proposals out of the woodwork because of it. Many aimed at providing housing for the community. It enabled housing where it wasn't a possibility before. It made housing possible. This is in opposition to the currently considered ordinance, which imposes further restrictions and requirements on existing zoning. In short, the ordinance in its current form only serves to make things less possible than before and retards development. Developers and landowners want to meet demand wherever it is, including for local workers and rental housing, but it still has to pencil out. The current state of city zoning makes that very difficult, and this will only serve to make it worse to the detriment of the city.
That's 2 minutes, I'm sorry. We did receive your comments in written form, though, both through the comment portal and an email. And if it seems like that was what you were reading, so we have the balance of it.
The email is the more complete one because of the comment form. But
Great,
thank you for your time, and thank you for putting forth the effort to address this issue.
Thanks, Kyle. Next, any other citizens to be heard? Folks want to speak?
My name is Caitlin Myers. I am speaking wearing a few hats this evening. I already submitted a letter signed on behalf of the Moab Area Housing Task Force, which includes 56 signatures so far. Actually, it's now higher than 56 since I sent that to you. But I'm speaking on behalf of the Housing Task Force, the Moab Area Community Land Trust, and myself as a private citizen living in the city of Moab, speaking in support of this. Specifically, I wanted to touch on the letter because that was submitted as public comment. I provided my own personal comments to you last week and sent a follow-up email after your public hearing with my personal thoughts. But speaking on behalf of the Housing Task Force, we wholeheartedly voice our support of this and highly recommend that the Planning Commission forward a favorable recommendation. Just drawing back to the Affordable Housing Plan, which the Housing Task Force is involved with authoring, there are recommendations by this body that recommend provisions for greater flexibility in city and county land use codes to support residential development. And there's also recommendations to expand the use of deed restrictions to protect existing and new affordable housing in our community. As you've seen in the letter, it's signed off by private citizens living in this community, nonprofits who support housing and supportive services for tenants in need of housing, as well as local businesses, hotels, restaurants, bike shops, a whole range. So while I'm the only one here speaking for this body, there's overwhelming support in this community for more attainable housing, more workforce housing. And this is a groundbreaking step by the city to ensure that as we build out, we will have housing for our workforce, which we are entering into an economic crisis, not just a housing crisis, because we don't have housing for our workforce. So thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And to folks who wrote and signed the letter as well. Any other citizens to be heard this evening? All right. Anyone else? Okay, we did receive, and I will pull them up here because I don't want to miss anything. Stop my timer. We received several comments between last week and this week, mostly supportive of the ordinance, a lot of them touching on the attainability of housing in town, how this is something that doesn't restrict ownership, it only restricts occupancy, so it seemed to be a good tool that wasn't overly burdensome or restrictive, and then also would allow for a robust rental market among locals. Several representing different community organizations, and then we had Mr. Kaiser's comments as well that we got in full via email, and from our comment portal, which he just read, and we have the full text of those available on the public records as well. Anything else, any other input people received from the community before we move on to our own discussion? Okay, great. Thank you to everyone who submitted comments digitally and showed up tonight or came to speak last week. We really appreciate all the input, as well as people who contacted us in the meantime and contacted city staff and city council members. That's all made its way back to us, so we thank you for the engagement. Okay, next item, our action item for the evening, a proposed ordinance 2022-05, an ordinance amending the text of the Moab Municipal Code, section 17.48, R3 multi-household residential zone, and 17.51 R4 manufactured housing residential zone, to add a use parameter requirement to the multi-household permitted use such that 42.5% of units be designated as active employment units to be occupied by qualified active employment households. So this is a briefing and then a possible action, all of which is in the agenda summary in our packet for the evening. Corey?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hopefully you remember how to do this in person better than I do.
Dust it off a little bit tonight, I think. I'm sharing screen from the barcode. Doesn't look like it's sharing. Here we go. Thank you, Summer. This is the brief presentation summary. How's that volume, Summer? That's all right? Maybe okay.
I can hear you.
We're going to be, yeah, perfect. Right. Reviewing very similar content to what we have reviewed up until this point, previously reviewed at the public hearing and discussion item on the 24th of March last week. Moving into tonight's item, an update on the timeline where we're currently at, as well as final draft content and red lines moving forward into City Council approval. Again, with this timeline, we find ourselves finally here at this March 29th meeting with the opportunity, of course, for the special public comment period, which we held just now as a part of Citizens to be Heard, forwarding a recommendation to City Council for the special meeting 31st, and then those opportunities, if necessary, for special meeting backup to complete the ordinance prior to the pending ordinance doctrine closing date on April 10th. This framework hasn't changed from the previous meetings. Again, outlining the sections of modification within the definition section, the chapter amendments for zoning. Again, this should be manufactured housing. You'd think I'd get it right at some point, maybe by next meeting. And then the active employment households, chapter 1764, which would be a new chapter to the Title 17 code. Within that chapter, again, maintained this structure of regulation within the active employment household, some repeated materials from the definition section. There has been a recommendation for modification from the City Council prior to this meeting, not too long before this meeting, so it has not been incorporated to the Commission to review in advance. So we'll talk about that tonight, and if it's a modification you'd like to make and incorporate as a part of the recommendation, we can do that. This was a slide that was included last time as well that again shows that rough breakdown between what a multi-household development number, general number of development might yield as far as the active employment units as a result of this specific percentage. What I'd like to note here, prior to this rational basis percentage that was produced by BAE Urban Economics Consulting Firm, was this operating number of a lower percentage. That percentage we had set kind of just as a potential realm of thought was that 33%. What we're seeing is in these numbers, and anybody can do this math, you just take the number of your development and multiply by that percentage to get what that yield would have been. But in these lower numbers of development, you're not seeing any real effective change. Yeah. It's so that 1-to-1 and 2-to-2-to-2, those were going to be maintained whether it was 30% or this 42.5. So on the smaller scale, we're really not seeing a major effective difference. As we, of course, get up into these larger unit developments, we are seeing where that exponentially starts to deviate in that percentage, of course. A major factor of that is you're going to see this 2.9, for instance, some of the change that within our legal review based on the style of requirement that we were producing had been a 2.9 would have yielded a 3 unit max. Because we are now rounding to in a decimal, a scenario in which a decimal is produced because of this percentage, we are rounding to the nearest whole number. That is the most defensible legal way to articulate the breakdown. So there's precedent for that. There was precedent for the way that it had been drafted before, but this is the more complete context in which to present it and move forward, which again brings it into, I think, a compromised, more defensible realm from where maybe the expectations had been set previously to where we're at our most defensible place able to move forward. So I also do have the maintained red line from our last meeting. With that public hearing, there were some minor change amendments that we had made. One will be identified to ensure we're in the correct red line here. was the addition of the San Juan County into the location of that billable service area for the full-time.
Was that something that city council seemed amenable to?
From the comments so far, yes.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, we received a comment from the public and from a council member, having not reviewed it since Friday, only having reviewed the previous week, suggesting this very same thing.
Oh,
So we're
cool.
right in line with it, what the expectations of council are, as well as some of our public members. In addition to this, you'll notice as a part of this definition section, and this is something that we can discuss and I think is somewhat open depending on how we want to frame it, is the active employment household definition in full does provide the requirement that one adult who meets one of the following criteria, provided that, however, that they're unrelated individuals living together in one household, at least 50% of all the adults comprising the household shall meet the following criteria. Basically giving the opportunity that in a living situation, we're not saying everyone must be, we're saying there can be one person that is employment driven and the other person could be whether it's homemaking or just not working. But where the amendment would come in is later down in our chapter 1764 section. It was during the drafting period we thought important to restate, which is always a tricky thing in code, if you're ever restating sections of code, that they ought to be identical, and if they are not, there can be discrepancies yielded from that. So the idea that active employment units shall be designated through one or the following criteria, we're talking about criteria here, but the definition doesn't seem to identify specifically here that 50% of that household as it's defined in the definition. So the options here are basically just repaste the definition in here with that additional context. This criteria, of course, being the primary focus, but having that active employment's full definition and then goes on to say, shall be designated through one or more of the following criteria. As to not create room for ambiguity, or we just eliminate this section and reference in a more concise way something of the nature of active employment unit shall comply with the criteria of the active employment standard in the MMC definition section 17. So removing it from the chapter and then replacing it back in definitions. What this does is when people pull up this chapter or we print it out and give it to an applicant, the intent was that they would be able to read through this entire chapter and understand in whole what that means. Mm-hmm. If we change that to a reference, then they are now printing out two sections, which isn't the end of the world. It'll just be something that we'll have to do. So it's really at the discretion of the commission what you think would be best operating wise to either increase the definition here to a full capacity or just use it as a reference point.
I think normally I'd tend towards keeping it brief and clean and cross-referencing, but in the ease, I also want it to be as user-friendly as possible, and
Right.
I am aware that that can get really confusing.
Our attorney has suggested referencing because, of course, legally that makes a lot more
Which
sense.
is what I would in another context, but
So
yeah.
in this scenario, I'm opting to, I think, agree with our consultant, our legal land use consultant in that same way that we just use it as a reference section, and then it'll be more of an advanced effort from the planning department to inform and get that information
Yeah.
consolidated for applicants when they come in.
I
It's
just
not
want
a huge
to, I just
deal.
want to make sure that anyone reading this can clearly understand it without having to
That's right.
go back and forth a whole bunch. I don't know.
So we can
What do
think about
others
it.
think?
I'm sure we're going to have much more discussion about it. Just want
Yeah.
something at the head of the meeting, want to throw out that I think it would be a staff recommendation to modify your recommendation by including this amendment as it goes to council. Then
Okay.
we'll formalize it for city council.
Great.
Really, everything else would be consistent with what you've reviewed in the packet and what everyone has reviewed previously.
What was the city council edition? Have you gotten there? Did you mention there was a change that we hadn't seen yet?
That was what I
That
was
was
just
that.
talking about.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Yep. So that red line should be consistent. So I'll stop sharing screen and open the time back up to discussion, questions, or where the commission would like to take this item.
Corey, just to clarify, what you just said was your preference, or the preference of the planning department, was to reference and to conduct it in that way, and to then take on the onus of providing the correct paperwork to the public. Correct. And that would be your preference, just to clarify.
It would be our staff recommendation that we keep it clean and use a reference section back to the definition section rather than having it repeated in two areas of the code.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that as well.
Anyone else have thoughts on that?
No, I agree.
Okay. Yeah, I think if folks generally agree that just having the reference back, as long as it's easy to find and
Isn't it usually just like a link that you click on?
Yeah,
in
I
the,
think
in
we
the
can do
electronic code, yeah.
a hyperlink within the codified version that it'll zip back. And then in addition to that, if we ever are printing out or creating, like Jessica has been doing, these yes trees and processing chart checklists, we can manually include those and make that an effort on our part, which is something we do with ADUs anyway, so it's not out of the sorts. It was, yeah, just why we didn't do that from the very beginning is an effort to keep it all within the same chapter, all housed there, but it does at this point make sense to make that change.
Makes sense.
I think that makes sense. As long as it's not a link that links to something that links back to where you just came from, because
Right.
that also.
Those are fun.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Corey. What do folks think? I mean, we've gotten a lot of public comment. We've had discussions. This is something we've been working on for a while. This is the time for questions, comments, clarifications, anything like that before we make a motion to do something.
That's right. Well, I really appreciate everyone's participation so far. This has been a really big project, 6 months, but a good portion of those 6 months were spent in pending, so it was a lot of effort, really squished together really fast, so it did take a lot of effort from everyone to come to a special meeting, do all the meetings that we've done in the past. Within the public comment and some of the, we've had inquiries, not so much as like an official comment to the commission, but inquiries for clarification from a lot of real estate communities. So I don't know if I'll reference this person specifically because they didn't officially submit comment, but a real estate person in Moab that was curious about how this might work, and a lot of those comments were actually answered in the ordinance. And so I think there is some misunderstandings about what the content of the ordinance is. So
Yeah.
I don't think I can fully, without just reading the ordinance flat out, address everyone's questions. But I think,
Yeah, please
so one
address-
question was
yeah.
about, what about folks in San Juan? And that was right in line with what we had been making amendments to last week. I think the highlight, and Kaya had highlighted this, is again, of the, what we'll call the larger umbrella of workforce housing, there are often mechanisms that call out affordability, ownership, and occupancy. And again, this is a focus, sole focus on occupancy, whereas the affordability and ownership components call in a much higher standard of regulation. This is, I think, one of the most approachable options to just at the very least maintain what we are calling attainable, meaning free market but localized. And within that, can have really an undefined realm. But every initial call that I've gotten that has been in major concern has been because there's a misunderstanding of what is actually being asked of those people. I think when we get down into the definition section of what active employment is, it becomes really, this is about as open as we can possibly make it locally without it just being irrelevant, because if we open it up any further, there is no difference to what's being asked. And as far as the need for housing supply versus need for what is, I think, pretty evident, a lack of employees within the community, a lack of workforce, to not just supply the businesses that, of course, we want to be fully staffed, but we are having, and as a community, a real challenge on staffing essential services, meaning the absolute necessary functions of our city, whether that's your water being supplied to your home, the sewer being taken away from your home, the electricity staying on, your medical staff being able to service your health care. These essential services can't staff. And we're, coming out of a time in history where it's, 100 years ago may have been facing similar challenges, but this is kind of unprecedented. So the results of the economy, and especially within the domestic international realm of cost of construction and cost of real estate, the binder of supply and demand economics does not apply here. I think trying to apply rationale to our times of construction and building is not working. And so just really quickly touch on the supply issue of, would this be a detriment to developers coming in? To a certain degree, I understand that this ordinance would amend what that bottom line at the end of the day looks like, but we are not putting an affordability cap on that. Therefore, really, the element of a intense change to feasibility or financing, nobody's been able to actually come to the table and show me how this is not going to allow their project to pencil. And I've had a lot of people ask, what does pencil mean? That means at the end of the day, are you upside down or within an appropriate profit margin over a certain percentage of time? And I understand that's a fear, but it hasn't been shown to me in any way that would be actualized. As far as what we were seeing and why this resolution, the initial resolution, was even called into effect, was that we were seeing this exponential runaway rate of in-first attainable housing development. So the point I want to make here is that, and I wrote this down so I could hopefully have it clear, is that we were seeing multi-household developments of a higher density that was unattainable at max density. So prior to this, specifically in the R3 and R4 zones, which are the most sensitive of that multi-household zone as far as the inverse effect. So there are other properties that allow multi-household that we are not requiring this on because there is not that inverse effect. It may be mostly vacant land, but what we're seeing in these sensitive historic zones is actually the reduction of attainable housing, not to say affordable, because again, affordable is a regulated or supplemented specific type definition. We're just saying something that is even feasibly approachable for somebody that works here on an average income. That those were being removed and replaced with units that were not attainable. And at the end of that exponential rate, where we had a number of applications that came in prior to this resolution, we're being outright advertised as this is not meant for locals. This is meant as a luxury condo, second home, as vacation oriented, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. And we're not eliminating that from this use. We're just saying we have to reserve at least a portion of that so that those that are being removed or the opportunity for attainable housing to be on those properties is not removed. So again, this concept that this will reduce housing and yield what might be the better option to do, lower density or higher cost. So less doors at a higher rate, that's what I'm hearing is going to be the result of this ordinance. While that might be true, what we were getting before was 0 attainable units. So if the threat is that the developers aren't going to choose this option, they're going to choose a lower density, higher scale that is unattainable. Well, that in my book, as far as attainable housing, equals 0 to 0. There were a lot of properties that were proposing prior to this ordinance apartments. In fact, a majority of them in the C4, again, a little bit disconnected, but some in the R3, some C5. And then with the one that we have seen in Lost Springs, these were projects that were predating the resolution as far as concept. They weren't submitted, which is why they are a part of this. But all of these truly apartment-oriented developments have no issue. It doesn't effectively change your bottom line because you're by definition creating that housing so to restrict a certain number of units that way rolls into the plan of what apartments are. So if apartments is the goal, this ordinance really doesn't affect drastically what the result of your project might be. Where this will curb is the open, unregulated development of houses specifically for national or international markets with an unattainable local orientation. So we work with developers every day, and our job as a planning staff is to promote and protect.
Sorry.
I'll wrap it up soon, I promise. Poor Vivian. My point being that our job is to be an advocate for property developers of all scales. But what we were seeing was an imbalance in our community, and what would have been the option is we do nothing, and as a result, the community runs its course, and maybe the free market takes care of a few. We've seen a large amount and long, as far as timeline, track record of communities that let the free market make the options, and they didn't make those choices. They got to a place where they were so built out that there was no option to come back. People were moved out of those communities that had been long-term locals there, and my family, I was one of those somewhere else, and what I think we'd like to see as a community is balance. And I think this is a step towards creating some balance. It's not the only tool, and it won't be the last tool. And maybe it'll be a tool that we come back to amend to make it a more fine, effective point. But if we don't start somewhere, it's very likely that people may not make these choices on their own. They may, but this is just one way to get our foot in the door to at least carve out a portion of the housing that we might be able to retain it as attainable. So that's my speech.
Thank you, Corey.
I'll open it, of course, back up to any other questions, but we didn't have any additional comments from the public comments coming in that we wanted to respond to. That was the biggest one. I think our comment tonight from Kyle touched on a little bit of that. We've had a lot of other developers calling me, so I really wanted to touch on that to start. And
No, thank you, because you've been interfacing with folks as this has gone along in the process. You probably have the best view on it of everybody. Yeah, I mean, you said a lot of what I agree with. It really is, you know, and I'll echo once again something that I feel like I've been a broken record on this, which is just like, this is not a silver bullet. It is not the only tool. We shouldn't treat it like that, but it is something that is going to address some of the sort of rampant new things that have been cropping up just in the last couple of years, as we're realizing that this is where the profit sector is going, and this is where the bottom line is, and something that's getting away from us quicker than we can get a handle on. But at the same time, you know, I think Mr. Kaiser in his email mentioned, you know, tools like inclusionary zoning. I completely agree. That's something that I think we need to get done quickly as well. You know, I think the city council now is definitely open to looking into those tools as well. So I'm happy to work on it as a planning commission, where we aren't going to maybe be stymied when it gets a step higher. You know, it's a complex problem that can't be completely addressed by any one single approach. But what we are seeing is what you said, that specific inverse attainable housing development, where we are losing existing housing that is not being replaced by actual occupied existing housing, even though the stock of technical residential units is going up in Moab and land is getting used and becoming unavailable. So, you know, I do think there's a strong, I think Mr. Kaiser also said there's a strong current of development and construction interest running through Moab right now that's not going away. I agree completely, and that's, I think, where that inclusionary zoning comes in, and why I think this is likely to be effective and not to result in folks just resorting to building, you know, one extremely expensive single-family home or one extremely expensive duplex. It's because, you know, the more bang for your buck is still going to be with that higher density at the end of the day, and you're still going to be able to make a great profit, but at the same time, there is that specific carve-out that's going to localize the market, not through affordability controls, but through just pure occupancy, which doesn't even go as far as like the county's high-density overlay ordinance, which is an incentive program, right? It's not the underlying zone that it's written into, But, you know, that has an affordability component, and it's about resident ownership, not just resident occupancy. You know, we're not even stifling the market, the international market, from purchasing any of these units, just as long as their investment property is occupied by someone who's one of those active employment households. So I think that's why I think it has a lot of potential, and I think, you know, especially being based in that really hard data from BAE, and especially with the round down on the number of units, which, like you said, functionally makes it essentially what we kind of threw out as a random number at the beginning, that 30%-ish of the units. It seems very reasonable to me, and I hope that it, you know, even for folks who don't want any sort of guidelines or zoning code or anything perceived as a restriction on the use of their private property, understand that, like, we live in a community and there's things that have to give some time, and this really is a very targeted, you know, scalpel instead of an axe on something that we need. So that's my speech.
With that 42.5, just really quick, about that updated BAE figure, that was a result of that formulation of data. So why, I mean, it's such a specific number. It's clearly not vague as a 0.5. And again, the way that this ordinance works is that we are exactly staying in line with what that recommendation is. If we're deviating from that, it's basically saying, yes, we understand the data, but we're going to deviate anyway, whether that was up or down. So this was kind of the only option we had for anybody that's curious as to how we came to this number, or why. I'd really have you look back at our city council presentation with Aaron Nusain from BAE that explains why and how that number was created, and creates that essential link to what it is we're doing. And again, as we look practically at these homes, if you just think about that percentage, or even the rough percentage from that slide that showed of the number of units, what percentage are going to be AEU. Those are the number of restricted. That means the greater percentage of that development is unrestricted in any way, which again means you can feasibly price that at whatever you wish, occupy it however you wish. It's just these allocated designated units that would be held to this requirement. I think
I'll let you come back, Becky, if you want to take her out. I was just going to say, we won't move on without you having a chance to speak. Okay.
I'm ready to calm down.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah.
So thank you, Kaya and Corey, for those summaries. I thought that was really good. And Kaya, I don't think you sound like a broken record when you say that, you know, this is not the silver bullet. This is just one piece of this puzzle of this housing crisis that we have to solve. I also want to state that, you know, I really appreciate all of the people that commented. I read through all of the forms, all of the comments on the 56 different people that signed, and all of the emails that we got. So I want to thank the community for participating.
Thanks, Jessa.
You want to?
if you want to talk.
Yeah, she just wants to bounce around.
Dad duty. Okay, Becky, your turn.
My turn. Where do I start? You guys want to stay here till 10 o'clock?
Go for it.
Just kidding.
You're a super important perspective.
So when we first started talking about this, it didn't really alarm me, and I didn't think it necessarily sounded like a terrible idea. The more I've thought about it and thought about it in different perspectives as a landowner, as a builder, developer, you know, I don't think it's going to be effective. I think it's another defensive tool like we've used in the commercial zones where we're playing defense, and all it does is stop what we want to happen from happening. So for instance, with commercial, where, we're taking nightly rentals out in the name of affordable housing and other commercial developments, did it help? No. And this, I think, is going to go down the same path where, I think it can be effective in bigger developments. I really do. Like some of the bigger townhouse developments where they've got dozens and dozens of units to allocate, or they have enough property to build like a little, not little, but a larger apartment style complex or condos, that they can make it pencil. Which leads me back, sorry, I'll try not to ramble around to different topics, but like when you're talking about the high density overlay in the county and how that compares and contrasts to this and how we're only stating that it would be, locally occupied and that that's a good thing. I do agree that that's a good thing, and I think that's a huge mistake that the county made by changing that. But what's different about in the city is our parcel size. Our parcels are tiny compared to the county. I mean, they have acres and acres of, big pieces of land where you can make projects with restrictions like this work. When you're looking around at our R3 and R4 zone, we don't really have that much, A, which we've already talked about in the past, we need more of, and B, they're small parcels. There's a few parcels that are decent size, like the one Satterfield's doing over on Cane Creek, where he was like willingly like, yeah, I'll do whatever % in his development agreement, but I don't think this is going to be effective on these projects that are like 3, 5, 4, 5 units. What the developers are going to do is they're just going to not build them, and you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get any houses. So, I mean, I think we need to rethink this and apply it to larger scale developments only. And I think really what we need to do is we need to call on the county to fix the high density overlay back to the way it was when everybody was rushing in there, excited to do developments. They ruined it. They totally ruined it. We could have so many houses, townhouses, apartments out in the county right now, but it just stopped. For 2 years, we've been sitting here with nothing happening. It's so frustrating. I just start shaking, I'm sure Caitlin shares some frustration there. I can speak from one of the developments that was listed at my office. They had a mixture of houses and townhouses. They couldn't get any local person to buy a townhouse because they didn't want a townhouse. They didn't want to live in a townhouse. They were choosing, they couldn't sell any of them. So they are changing their plat to single-family homes only so that people will buy them. If we are in that dire of a situation, why wouldn't someone want to buy a townhouse? I can't figure that out. I lived in a townhouse. I thought it was great. When the police chief was reaching out about housing, I pointed him to that direction. Nobody wanted one. They don't want to live in a townhouse. I couldn't believe it. So if we're thinking that all of a sudden, stuffing this into these small, much, much smaller scale townhouse developments in town to fix something, I don't see it happening. I really don't. I think it's just going to stop development. And it's going to hurt a bunch of people that are trying to do developments, or they're going to start doing the workaround. They're going to subdivide it into 3 single-family home lots. They're going to subdivide it into 2 twin home lots. And then where does this end? Do we just keep going after everybody and start deed restricting every new development, single-family home, twin home, everything? Like, where are we going to stop? We're just going to chase it around. It's like we're standing at the ocean telling it to stop, and it's just like splashing around us because it's the ocean. It doesn't care. It's going to keep coming. So I think this is a very effective tool and makes a lot of sense for apartments. And we have apartment developers here. We have a lady that we've been working with for years that wants to build nothing but apartments for local people that live here. She's ready, she's willing, she's ready to work. They're here. So I don't think I'm sorry, Corey. I don't think this is a good idea.
It's not
It's not going to be effective.
Becky, I don't see how that would stop her from building apartments. That's not going to affect her at all.
I didn't say that it would affect her. She's more than willing to put this restriction on those. I'm saying that this would work with apartments. It does not work with small-scale townhome developments. If you can only build 3 units and one of them has to be deed restricted, that's a huge unknown for that developer. You know, you're looking at probably $300 to $350 a square foot to build the townhome, which at 1,700 square feet is about $600,000, excluding land. If you're going to buy a lot that is zoned for this, you're going to be probably $400,000 to $500,000. So there's another $150,000 on top of the $600,000. That's $750,000 just to build this. So if a developer is looking at it like that, they're thinking, well, I got to be able to rent this for like $3,000 a month. That's a huge unknown if someone locally employed is going to be able to afford that or not. You know what I mean?
Well, I think there's a lack of housing for all segments of the population in Moab, whether you're a medical professional and you're making a higher income, or you're in the service industry and you might be making less. I think the key here is that this is attainable housing and not affordable housing.
It's still just an unknown when you're a developer building. You know, they're going to choose not to build and have to abide by this ordinance. They're going to do something else. We're not going to get what we want, is what I'm saying. It's not going to work.
I guess my question now would be, so you just said the unknowns are going to result, they're not going to be able, but what's happening now is like the whole zone that's sitting around us right now at City Hall, which this would qualify for, you know, I don't know what would be an incentive for developers other than having this requirement in the underlying zone, because the most recent build of townhomes in the R3 zone, one is currently for sale for $829,000 for a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom home. And I mean, if we talk about like attainability, like that is what the market is doing right now. Like that is the track record that the market without this restriction has right now. And I don't know what the incentive would need to be for the developer other than like the pad ordinance, of course, which we all know we have to figure out, we all have to fix, because that is the incentive-based program. But what we're seeing right now is just like, you know, it's the house, you know, next door to where I lived when I first moved to Moab, in a silly little, what I'm realizing now was an illegal internal ADU. But you know, it's like over $800,000 for a townhome. You know, you're talking about like $3,000 for rent, or you're not sure even if the cost to build, but like, gosh, if you put like $100,000 down on an $829,000 townhome, your mortgage is still like $3,750 a month, which is still not at all attainable. And then you're tied into that too, which could be really get you underwater fast for somebody.
I just think, I don't disagree with the concept here. I just think it needs to apply to larger scale projects, and it needs to, you can't just take from people. You have to give something. If you keep taking, it's just going to stop people. They're not going to build. So what you could give in return is higher density. You could get them to, you know, if you're going to take 2 units, give them 2 units. Remove parking, lessen the setbacks, raise the height. Make it so they can get those 2 extra units and still the other 5 that they want, so that it works. Or, I just lost my train of thought.
That's okay, take your time.
Which is, like with the county, those, you were getting something. You were getting higher, you were going from 1 house per acre or 10 houses per acre to 40 houses per acre. So of course people were like, yes, now this makes sense. Let's go and build apartments and townhomes and, you know, a mixture of both. And it's so sad to me that none of those people in the county can see, like, everybody was so excited and ready to build, and then it just like stopped. It's crazy.
There's still a lot happening though with the
Not really.
HHOs.
There's one development, and the Peak View that I know of, that's actually like getting built, and The carpet got ripped out from underneath them with the townhome thing. And so anyway, I just think we need to quit looking at this like, in any of our zones and our codes, like if we see prosperity and redevelopment and you know, good economics happening, we don't have to be threatened by that and think we need to go attack it and play defense. Let's play offense. Let's help the situation. You know, let's give them something so that we can get what we need. Just like what we talked about in the commercial zone, which is a big part of why I was agreeable to vote for that with the nightly rentals. I thought we were going to put them back in and mix in a requirement to have ground floor other commercial use, and we never did it. We never finished it. We just left all those people hanging out there, and I think that sucks, and I think this is going to do the same thing.
Well, it's
just going to
happening.
stop.
I mean, eventually.
It's
right?
been how many years?
Yeah, it's supposed to. It's just, but we
So
don't
to
have
stay
housing,
on
so we don't have
track,
enough
can I-
staff to staff our planning department.
So I think
Becky,
yeah.
just a quick, before you chime in, I have a quick question. So I understand what you're saying about, and that makes good sense, right? We know that requirements and deed restrictions and set aside obviously pencil out lots better the more units you have, right? The higher density stuff, the bigger developments, and I understand that. But to your earlier comment, and I think Mr. Kaiser mentioned this in his email as well, and live comments, that, you know, okay, well, when there's that restriction, they're just going to subdivide it down and make it individual units. What would stop someone who could build 40 units where this requirement would apply from subdividing it down so it was just lots where it was just 4 units or 3 units where this would no longer apply if we don't have the floor on it as well as the ceiling? That would be my concern with that, because I don't see how that's not a concern in both of those situations, right? Like, you say the requirement is there in the underlying code once you reach a certain threshold of units. If the people, if there are folks who are property owners or developers who, rather than meet this underlying zone requirement, would subdivide their property out so that it didn't apply anymore, why would they also not do that regardless of how many units they could put on in the first place? Because if it's, does that make sense? Am I explaining that right?
I hear what you're
Yeah. I guess that would be my question, because if your mindset is, I'm going to subdivide this down so I don't have this requirement apply regardless of how much the community needs it, I don't know why would.
30% boost over like 100 because that's what's being restricted.
I just don't know why that wouldn't be the mindset regardless of what the situation is, as long as that was an option to go smaller and therefore not have some sort of restriction on
There's
it.
definitely different strategies to
Yeah.
each of those, and mostly within the ownership realm and what the actual product creation would be and how that works as an ownership model. What I do want to note about the density in our R3 is I think, and this has been a concept mostly from the previous council, I think, with the strong proponent from our previous mayor, is that we needed to increase our density, and that was the ADU ordinance. It was our reevaluation of the R3, R4, even increasing the R2 some, which, before I get into the next point, there is inherent conflict. Every time there's development, even if it's a below max density development in the R3 or in the R2, we get calls from every single neighbor. How can the city let this happen? This is not what Moab is designed to be. How could you allow this density, this, in some words, quote unquote, monstrosity from being built next to me? So every time somebody builds something, that's the comment we get from the community. And it, unfortunately, not anybody's ever said it verbatim, but there's a lot of not in my something being incorporated into this. So I want to say that our existing density in the R3 is already so high that it's not actually feasible. And we've talked about this before. Your max density is well above what the practical development is because of other development standards. So like Becky and Kai have said in the past, if we want to effectively make change, we can't just look at density and say, yeah, we're increasing density, we're going to fix problems. There's parking requirements, there's setbacks, there's heights, there are development parameters that are in place right now that keep you in a development envelope or buildable envelope, regardless of what your density is, just based on parameters. And a lot of these are based on health, safety, and welfare parameters. So we've now allowed more density than what is actually feasible. So when people come in to develop, they have an expectation higher than what is reasonable, not because we're making them do it. These are the rules. So there's just from the get-go a higher expectation than what is feasible based on just safety standards for construction. That being said, why I think the HDHO is so different and why it works is because it was already such a low standard that when they had that inclusionary housing bump, there was noticeable gain.
Yeah.
Why has the pad not worked? Is because it was a pretty well balanced, you know, the way we approached that was pretty even. So when developers looked, well, I might not get quite as much density as I want, but at the end of the day, I'll actually probably make the same amount of money or more not doing this because there is that affordability dedication component. So this is something that's coming out of the legislature right now, is there's potential action to reduce a municipality's authority to create and enforce and regulate inclusionary housing. They're just going to take this tool away. So whatever you had in place, they'll allow you to maintain that, but they're not going to allow you to create any new inclusionary housing tools, which, if that is the case, we are going to have to downzone every single zone in order to create a separation that there's a bonus element that could work. So that they would allow a voluntary, because we can't, by say, remove inclusionary housing, I mean in a mandatory context. There's two types, voluntary and inclusionary. So it would allow voluntary, basically the same thing as a DA, but in order to create a carrot from nothing, you have to downzone in order to create a manufactured carrot, which is a terrible planning perspective in my opinion, because then you're now doing contract development, and we don't want to do that. We want developers to be able to develop as they wish, let the community take care of itself the way they see fit. And if we're going to be dictating every single development, that's a whole different job. I mean, that's a whole different staff, that's a whole different situation. So I don't think it is so complex, and it doesn't mean that we should just throw our hands up and walk away, but it certainly doesn't mean that any one thing is the right option or this isn't the right option. But I think Becky's comments are coming from a really full perspective place. So I'm really happy Becky said them. I hope the commission takes those to heart. I also think that by doing nothing, we're going to get nothing as well.
I don't think we should do nothing.
And that's what you're
I'm
saying.
not-
You're saying we should.
I think that this is totally appropriate to apply to apartments. Every single apartment developer, they'd probably be fine with 80%.
The only reaction I might have is it doesn't matter to apartments. So the tool of why this was created was because of national, international market townhomes, second homes that were specifically replacing existing low-density local housing. So it's the inverse development is what was the real problem, but then we also looked, well, within this zone, there aren't many vacant areas, so looking at it as a whole, that is the one thing this ordinance is supposed to be fighting. So apartments, they fold in, but they're not the focus. It is second homes designed not for locals that were the issue. When the Multicultural Center provided its data, displaced families, homeless families in Moab right now, it was because of projects like this. And by this, I mean this example of an unattainable product coming in over the top of what had been a most attainable or sensitive product, like a mobile home park or something that's traditional. And again, I think Josh, who's the applicant for Lost Springs, had a good component that they're trying to bring housing in an apartment format, which should be an attainable format. But to do that in our community, which is already pretty well built out, you're going to have to remove some of the historic existing and somewhat less current housing. I want to be sensitive, of course, but they're mobile homes that are either pre-76 or pre-HUD that we would not permit nowadays, to put it that way.
They're not safe.
They're not safe. And, not taking away from anybody's housing situation, if, of course it's your home, but we want to create new, safe housing, so you do have to create new, safe housing to do that. So it is, I think, like Becky said, it's not nothing, it's not doing nothing, but it's not going over the top. This legally was the best option as a use parameter to stay as an amendment to a use parameter, as opposed to going into any particular type of legal action zoning that is different. So again, because of the state laws, got wedged into this tool, unable to make it more sophisticated, because then we'd be potentially creating hazard for ourselves. So I think we've acknowledged that. There were many options of the draft that would have, I think, addressed a lot of these issues, but were removed intentionally by our legal review because it got too close to what may be a legal land use regulation. And so this is the one avenue that we found and the one percentage that works. And we are it's either this or it's nothing. And that's the council's real choice is this might not be perfect, but it's either this or nothing in this context. So I think, like Becky's saying, I think another tool in a different way might be a good way to mitigate some of the other issues we're talking about, but this is what this is. And so again, it's not passionate. I mean, I am passionate, obviously, about this, but it's not emotional in the sense I am looking at this from the best interests of the community based on the facts we have and based off of the tools that we have. So
Yeah.
if it doesn't work, I'm not mad that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But if it does work, it works, and okay, that's the tool we have to work with. So
And I think that's an important point, and I completely agree, Corey, that's the theme of the night. But that, this, and I think there are provisions in our code, which are things that we tried in the past that I think got a little gummed up in the works and then became ineffective. The pad is the constant example. Becky and I agree on that. We agree on the issues with parking requirements, stifling more units being built where there is existing density that's to be had, or businesses succeeding, or people in commercial zones. It's a huge problem. There are quick fixes, things we need to address in the code, and I'm really hopeful that we can move on to those quickly after this. And I think the pad is really one of them because, like you said, you want it to actually be an incentive, not just something that someone looks at and says, either way, I still come out the same. Why would I go through this complicated process? So, we need to fix that, and that's the other tool, the incentive. But I do see this as being, we have as of right now, we have a 100% track record of the market not addressing this situation. So letting it go or having it apply to places where maybe there'll be one or two things that'll pop up is just it just seems untenable, for the state that the community's in right now. And I think that's really, for me, what it comes back to. And if the very unfortunate, and I really hope that the developers and the folks, the property owners listening, don't just decide to make it so whatever they're building doesn't apply to this, and we just end up with a bunch of really expensive single-family homes or existing single-family homes staying and being sold for the price of a fourplex. We'll know it doesn't work, and we can fix it or do something different. Or if we're seeing it, because I hand to God, do not want to stifle development. That is not at all my intent. I'll go to bat on the fact that we need more housing and we need more housing built. But I do understand that, again, the market is just not touching the stuff that we need. And that is our role, to look out for the community and try something. So.
Corey, you
my
said
spiel.
we've got almost 1,000 apartments in the pipeline over the next 5-10 years. Was that,
apartments?
yeah, in the work plans, by the college, around
Not quite.
800? What was the
Units specifically. So that's
Yeah.
a mix of
Yes,
condos,
the unit count.
condos, townhomes, individual units. Usually we're not tracking this in the form of duplexes, but it could be small development, so 3 single households or something like that, up to apartments and subdivisions. So we're looking at the spectrum of those development applications, and we're just collecting the raw number of units. So they are coming in all variable degrees. So it's not just 1,000 apartment units, it's 1,000 units that are conceptually coming in different forms.
Within city limits.
Within city limits.
Yeah, so we've got that many units in the pipeline. We could apply this concept to those higher density, apartments and condominium flats. That to me makes more sense than going after a 3 or a 5-plex. Because the 3 or 5-plexes are the ones that are going to just not build, change the type of build.
Right.
It's not going to be effective, and you're just hurting people that are just doing a little development. There's not enough profit to run the risk of not knowing what you're going to be able to rent one unit for and potentially not be able to sell it because they're worried about what they can rent it, you know? I just think larger scale projects, it makes sense. Apply it to that. Let's put some pressure on the county to fix the high-density overlay. You know, they need to take part in this. We're all in the same valley, and they have the biggest pieces of land or annex land into the city and apply it there. I had one more thought, and I forgot. So I was wondering what my baby's doing. Oh, I hate my mind.
She's chilling.
Or, oh, this was my third idea. Just so the 56 people that signed your letter, let's challenge them to deed restrict their own houses. See what they, you know, if you guys are strongly for this, put it on your house. Think about how that feels to you and how that will impact your future. Are you okay with it? If you are, great, do it. You know, maybe we could get a fair amount of people deed restricting their own houses for local households in the future. You know, I think BAE said about 56% of the houses in Moab right now are locally, like, occupied, you know, so within the city limits, so.
Yeah, 46% of the employment
Let's call on
workforce is in
all the people that are
town.
super passionate about this to deed restrict their own house and see if we can get any there. Why does it have to be all on developers, small-scale developers, you know?
I'll say most of the people I know, my contemporaries who are building houses right now, are building into programs where they are deed restricted because they don't have any other option because housing isn't available. So whether it's through the Moab Community Land Trust or Community Rebuilds or otherwise, everyone that I know is. And that just seems to be the only option on the table. So, you know,
Everybody you know that owns a house in
everybody
Moab?
who's seeking to build housing or settle here at this point, who, for example, is of my demographic, my age group, call it 25 to 40, is in that position. And so it isn't really an option at this point. They are going to be deed restricted because that's the housing that's available. And people choose to live here and to choose that option because they'd rather be here than be forced out. And so
And that's great. I think those
it's an
programs.
important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's important. I've always thought those programs seem like they should, you know, if you're getting, you know, into those houses at that price point, it seems appropriate. I'm talking about existing homeowners throughout the community.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And-
deed restrict your own house.
I'm in the process of doing that on my
Yeah,
house.
I've heard you talk about that.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Sure.
If you're willing to do it, do
In
it.
the R4. So, here we go.
Kaya, will you take a motion?
Yes, I will take a motion if we can have a motion and we can have further discussion if folks feel like it, or we can continue to discuss. Councilmember Wojciechowski, did you have anything to say? You looked, so we have our city council liaison who's here, who's not at the table as well, which we can certainly let speak.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on a couple of the things that were stated here. I agree, Becky, this is a defensive maneuver, but it's a defensive maneuver that was born out of necessity. As Corey had alluded to, the market was indicating that it was moving towards building these like luxury high-end condos. And so we don't want to stifle development, but we also need to make sure that we're accounting for the type of housing that is being introduced into our overall housing stock. And so if we do have all of these luxury townhomes, it's not like, I kind of agree with Corey that it's like a 0 to 0 if people don't take advantage of or don't build developments that would fall under like the constraints of this amendment or ordinance. But every single second home that gets added to our community also increases the local burden in terms of being able to support all of those things while reducing the available property and like to actually be able to house those locals. And so slowing down second homes to a certain degree actually puts us slightly in a better position to take more offensive measures. Yeah, I don't want to constantly react, because I think if you're always on your heels, you're not going to make the best decisions possible. But if there's somebody swinging a knife at you, like it makes sense to try to block that before you go on your own counteroffensive. And I feel that this is kind of the move that the city is making in response to that. As Kaya has alluded to, and like what you've mentioned, is that like for 30 years, housing for local like employment has been an issue, and it has never been addressed. If anything, the market and all of those things have only made the situation more dire, because we are in an area where the total amount of developable land is extremely limited. And so if more second homes get built, that puts us in an even tougher situation, because we have less available resources to try to counteract like this increased burden that's falling upon the community. And to a certain degree, there is kind of like you were talking about, like, let's have local homeowners take on the responsibility if they're so passionate about this. I think like the same can be said about a bunch of the people who are developing these situations, who are selling. I get where people are coming from in terms of like individual decisions and trying to maximize their profit and everything, but collectively, when you have a lot of people acting in self-interest, it has the potential to do some really devastating harm to the community, as we're seeing with the trailer parks in our community right now, where simultaneously several like landowners have decided that they can turn the largest profit right now by redeveloping those trailer parks, and our community is on the precipice of a crisis. And so there are people in town that have owned their homes for 20 plus years, have probably paid off their mortgage, and I keep hearing story after story about renters being given 1 month's notice because the landlords wants to remodel their home and rent it for an extra $500 a month. So we're in this situation where, like, from all sorts of different directions, our local workforce and our ability to continue to support Moab as a community as it develops is diminished further and further and further. And so, yeah, it's a defensive measure. I don't want to be in this position, but it's the position that we're in. It's the reality of the situation. And so if this can at least buy us some breathing room, because I'm 100% for inclusionary zoning and seeing ways that we can try to incentivize this type of development, but I want us to be able to stop development that's going to limit the amount of options that we can have for that inclusionary development.
Yeah, I think what you were saying, Corey, about like if there's nowhere to go up from what we have, there's no incentive that's left on the table. So it's harder to get the buy-in, even with good incentives on the table, if we fix like the pad.
Right. I mean, purchasing of deed restrictions, like the bail and deed program Caitlin Myers had brought to the city as an option. We don't have a property tax. We have no money to give to people to do this. We have no tools, and we're already so dense. It's really, if we lose any more tools, that will be our only option, is to downzone everything to artificially create a need, which we don't want to do. We really can't do that, and I can't see our city going that direction, but that is the discussion in the state of Utah as potentially the only option to do that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, kind of what Corey touched on, this really does seem as though it's like the least heavy-handed approach that we can take to try to enact some change. Obviously, like, we don't have full control over the market, and we can't like dictate or by like mandate or anything like that. And I don't think that a lot of us really want to. But it's one of those things that right now it just feels like we're stuck in like a hole on the river or something, and yeah, we can kind of just like let go and hope that the current's gonna get us out of there, but we've been stuck in that hole for 30 years now, and I'd rather take some proactive action to try to increase the likelihood of like survivability in this situation, than just kind of continue to fall to the whims. And yeah, I don't know that I have much more to say. This is obviously like an incredibly complex issue that there's so many factors that go into it, and there's always going to be those people that are going to try, regardless of I think what incentives we offer or whatever we do, are going to try to work around the system to maximize profits. And like that's something that we're just going to have to accept as a matter of fact, but yeah, I think as long as we can do whatever we can to preserve the chance of even getting into housing for our locals, like that's a meaningful thing or direction to take. Thank you for
Thanks
listening.
so much, Luke. We appreciate your input, and it's really nice to have you here to sort of directly relay the conversation to the rest of City Council. Any other comments before we take a motion? And again, if we have a motion on a table in a second, we can have further discussion, and Ms. Vivian can help.
So I was thinking about the, like lower density as far as for Becky, actually. And so you take a house here and you have to buy it, and so that's initial cost, just trying to put the numbers down. And it's gonna say, I need probably a terrible, like $600,000 to buy the lot, everything. You have to demolish it and you have to build something, and you can get 5 townhomes out of it, like something that we've seen here.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to just build a higher luxury single home, or just the 5 of them, even having 3 of them out? Because if you can sell 3 of them for $600,000, and 2 of them you can sell, I guess, market for locals. Somebody's only going to buy for $400,000. Does it not make sense to still go that route?
I mean, you'd have to pencil it out, but like just roughly figuring math at $350 a square foot.
$350 a square foot.
If you figure
I
about $350 a square foot to build it, and then you're looking at buying the land, demoing the house, that's why I'm saying, like, these small projects, like, I think they're just not gonna build anything. Like what we're referencing over here by the ballpark, second and second, I'm assuming that's what people have been referencing, like, they probably just wouldn't build them, so they'd just be sitting there the way they were, you know? So if you're thinking you're gonna get something out of those, I think we're not. I think we're not going to. I think that we could get somewhere with this with larger scale developments.
You think you end up eventually just sitting with nothing? It's the same house and it sits there for forever.
Yeah, I think they just won't do it.
And it's just
Can
0
I
equals
chime
0.
in?
That's what I think.
Jess?
Yeah, go for it.
So I had a phone conversation with a developer yesterday who told me that they right now are not taking on any projects for people who are building second homes, that their desire is to do projects like this where they are active employee households. And so I disagree. I think there are developers in town who are wanting projects and will develop projects like this, because I think it does still pencil, and you don't have to go high end on all the finishes and make it 350 a square foot. I think you can still build for less and still make a profit, especially in these lots that we're talking about where there was one home on an R3 lot that could be built out to 3 or 4. So I know from that one conversation, there's at least one developer in town who is interested.
I know developers interested as well, but more in the format of apartments or high-density condos, not 3 to 5 unit townhouses. It's not, that's what I'm talking about when I'm referencing, like, I don't think this is gonna work. I don't think it's gonna work on small-scale developments, and I think we're just hurting those people with the little lots where they wanna do a little row of townhouses. I don't think it's gonna get, we're not gonna get anything from that. And I don't like feeling like we're gonna hurt people and their investments or, you know, plans that they wanna, you know, that they're hoping to do. I think that's lame. I think we can raise the threshold to a higher unit count so that it will more than likely get built and utilized and get some housing for people without, I don't know.
From construction, not what the numbers are, but construction of that, I don't know if we could.
You can't
legally, it would.
Well, then why can we pick 3?
Because it's the plain use parameter. It's saying that within these zones, this use, the multi-household use, is because of that burden or essential link that we're needing to create. So if we decided, like we have on some other requirements, that 7 or more of the multi-household use, that would have taken a different analysis study to break away why we aren't requiring it 3 to 6. So, and again, we would likely want to just get into that maybe with our both consultants to see, but because we did explore those options. That's the only reason I say is we had looked at pretty much every perspective of how we could have done this, and it was this is the style that we would have to do it to be defensible. If we were to break it out into a particular number of units or beyond that, or a particular percentage, it changes that rational basis entirely, which I don't pretend to understand the whole ins and outs of that between our legal consultant and the urban economics results. But I do know that this was the rational basis that we could develop this ordinance on. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just, from my understanding, I feel like if we were to like tonight say, oh, I want to make an amendment to that, I don't know if it would be legally defensible within the same way that we framed it.
Yeah, that
It
tracks.
doesn't mean that we couldn't come back with a different study and a different analysis to support something specific to that, but
Yeah, that tracks with my,
it's a little, it's
Legal understanding of it
just a
too.
different product that we'd be getting.
Well, and I think we can give people more density if we change parking. That's
Yes.
a really easy way to
That
give people more density.
yes.
To get another unit or two or 5 or
So
whatever.
that's, again, where we're talking about, we have this density that's allowed, but there's all these parameters. That's the bonus maybe, because that's a built-in, baked-in bonus of the density's already there, but we have these parameters that are keeping you there. So if we were to decrease the parking requirement or decrease some of these other design elements,
Yeah.
they would be able to make up to the point where that's already what's permitted, but you're doing it in a way that is already built in. So that is absolutely an option versus trying to
Give that.
tweak densities or tweak other things that already exist. That would be something that might be more applicable. For sure.
Another feedback I've gotten from an apartment developer, high-density housing developers, our heights are just like 5 or 7 feet too short to really make buildings work and get the amount of units that they need. It's like, I think it was 5 feet.
It was 35 feet.
35
From
versus-
understanding
versus 30
with the
now,
building
which is
official,
what
as
we
we talk
have.
about plate heights, what is the standard living space between those plate heights? And by plate heights, I mean joist construction of what you might consider your ceiling and floor of the next floor.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. And then your roof, which is a different type of framing. So to get that under 30 feet, you're going to have a living space that is 8 foot or less. 8 foot on an absolute maximum, or you go to a super advanced construction with steel and you only reduce it by a fractional amount. So something like that would definitely help. So both the height and parking are the low-hanging fruit right now.
Can we add that in and say,
At this point to this ordinance, I don't think that would be the mechanism to do
Yeah.
that. And the council has already directed me to not adjust those design parameters in this. So I was attempting to adjust some of the parking already, and they did not want to do that. And I think we talked about it as a council,
Yeah.
or commission, excuse me. But those are two strategies that I think need to be brought back to the table. They've been
Yeah.
brought to council multiple times now, at least 2 occasions in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
So at this point, the collective voice is getting louder. I talked to 2 local business owners today that this is the number one thing standing in their way of creating another small, very local-oriented business is their site couldn't accommodate more parking, but
Yep.
they had the commercial space for
And you
it.
see that all the time.
yes.
Yeah.
So that
parking
is
so-
the number one thing. Height would be the second.
Yeah.
And then there's a bunch of other parameters, of course, we can get into, but
I'm down.
as a part of this ordinance, I don't necessarily, from a staff perspective, agree that that is something we could include here.
Yeah, I think
At this
that's-
time,
yeah.
anyway.
Well, I'm sorry, you guys, I can't get behind this, I can't support it. I don't like taking from property owners, and I feel like that's what this is doing. It's taking and not giving enough back to make it, a better fit for everyone. So I think this is really on the county. They have so much land, I can't say it enough.
And tax money.
That's where our high-density housing needs to be. They have giant parcels of land that, that's where we gotta go.
Yeah.
Parcels in town, they're just too small.
disagree.
We're not gonna make a difference, I don't think.
No, and thank you, Becky, for your comments and your perspective. We are all here to represent citizens of Moab, and I think you do that very well, so thank you. Okay, Vivian, would you like to make a motion?
Let's get out of here.
Yes.
Quick question, Kaya.
Yeah.
With regard to this motion, do we need to add language for what we had discussed before about
Yes,
reference?
we do.
Okay.
And we can make it fairly vague, right, to account for the staff recommendation.
Correct.
Yeah. So you could say something like, amended to add the text exclusion as recommended by staff and preferred by city council or something like that.
That would work.
Yeah.
And it's earlier on the record, me stating what that reference would be.
Yes.
So we have it on record.
Correct. So, as always, the recommended motion, we can, after our discussion and consideration, we can recommend ordinance 2022-05. Positive recommendation, we can continue or table it with specific direction to staff, or we can make a negative recommendation giving specific findings for the reason for that. Okay, I will move that the Moab Planning Commission positively recommend ordinance 2022-05, an ordinance amending the text of the Moab Municipal Code, section 17.48, R3 multi-household residential zone, and 17.51, R4 manufactured household residential zone, to add a use parameter requirement to the multi-household permitted use such that 42.5% of units be designated as active employment units to be occupied by qualified active employment households, with the addition of the modification as recommended by staff on the record earlier this evening at our meeting.
I'll second.
Okay, I have a motion and second by Jessica. Any discussion, further questions, comments, anything like that from anyone before we vote? And thank you again, members of the public, folks who are here, folks who provided emails and comments. It really, truly helps the process to know that there has been input. People are aware of what's happening, and whether they agree or not have had the opportunity to have those voices heard. And I really do think a lot of the folks who had qualms with the recommendation that we might be making this evening, I think that really, truly helps staff and ourselves to prioritize what we need to get rolling on next, because there are, like Corey said, low-hanging fruit and things that can really help incentivize the things that we all want to happen, that are other tools other than this. So we really thank you for that.
All right, roll call vote. Jill?
Aye.
Jesso?
Aye.
Jeremy?
Aye.
Becky?
No.
Ruben?
Hell yeah.
Kaya?
Aye.
All right.
Okay, motion passes 6-1. Am I counting right? No, I'm not.
Nope, 5
5 to 1.
Yep.
Who else are we missing? Oh,
Wait,
wow,
I'm two.
that's math.
It's 2 here.
1.5 to 1.5. Okay. Apologies for it's hard with someone on Zoom to remember how many people there are here. Okay, thank you, everybody. And just, Luke, I'll just say, if y'all have any questions about anything before your meeting on Thursday at City Council, please approach Corey, myself, anybody. I want to make sure that we set you guys up for success as well at your special meeting. Corey, future agenda items?
We are working through some DRT items right now. Hopefully, some of those will be ready by the 14th, or at least the applicants are ready to. Those are potentially one subdivision and potentially a level 2 site plan application for the Hoodoo Hotel Phase 2 casitas. There are, I would say, 4 or 5 on deck. These two, I think, are prepped to be ready if they can get their applicant turnaround prepared. I don't think there's anything else that's been coming for you at this time. So we've got our hands full. We'll get through with this and I think reset our sights and really get moving. I'm going to open it up, Jessica, if I've forgotten anything else or anything on your radar. That was a no if you couldn't hear it.
When is a good time for Becky and I to discuss with you / make a proposal or recommendation about the parking?
If we wanted to,
Stuff.
even as soon as next week, have a preliminary meeting.
Do it.
And then let's start drafting following that. Getting into that, again, ordinance drafting, we'd submit an application the way we have with
It would just be an
this
amendment. Just a quick code amendment.
We wish it'll be that way. We'll cross our fingers. But yeah, the idea would be it would be a development code amendment process, text amendment, very similar to this process-wise, but obviously going to be
Much simpler.
yeah, it'd be more of a minor amendment to existing text versus generation of a new ordinance. But we can do that as soon as next week.
Cool. All right. Thank you, and it's so nice to see everyone in person. I just couldn't be happier to be here.
I hate Zoom.
I'm so done. I'm so done with Zoom. All right, I adjourn this special meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission.